The ancient bard Homer was not an academic. He was not a scholar. And yet, when people finally decide that they want to read a good translation of the Iliad or the Odyssey, they almost always turn to a scholarly translation. Today, I want to talk about Homeric translations, how to choose them, how to think about them, and how to make the best decision for yourself, for your classroom, or simply for setting up yourself and others around you for real success and enjoyment as a reader, as a human. I've studied Homer since I was very young. I've read many translations. I've created one of my own, and I've taught Homer to busy professionals who wanted a first serious encounter with these poems, but didn't want to feel lost or inadequate. A lot of us, when we read Homer for the first time, we sometimes feel like something's wrong with us. We're not smart enough to get it. And so we stop reading. And that's who I want to talk to. My goal has never been to create the most academically applauded translation of Homer. My goal has been much simpler, and I think much rarer, which is to help first-time readers actually experience Homer as a living storyteller. Now, I do come from a tradition of storytellers of Homer's translations that we're going to talk about. This video is not about promoting my own translation, although I do hope you'll check it out. Here's a stack of a bunch of books and translations on Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. This one is mine, and I will pitch it at some point, but I'm actually going to tell you my first recommendation for Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey before I created my own Iliad. So there was a book when I'm teaching this back in the day, I would recommend a particular book that would be the book we would read together and discuss. I'll give you that recommendation, and then I'll talk a little bit about my own translation. We'll also talk about other popular translations. So I've created a whole framework for how to approach and think about and experience these translations and how to choose them. So I will be recommending translations other than my own. I actually have one that I recommend for first-timers, and I have a personal favorite. So there's differences as you get into this. But here's the problem that I see over and over again with this question, whether it's in schools, classical high schools, colleges, but particularly within the broader reading public. I get asked this question all the time. And the question I'm always asked is, which translation of Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey is the best? Which is the best? And what I've noticed after decades of reading in Homer, listening to advice, even from the greatest classicist of our time and all time, classicists I admire, is that much of the guidance people receive is deeply misguided. Not because it's stupid or malicious, but because it's aimed at the wrong audience. And the irony for me is that the spirit of the question is absolutely perfect and wonderful and a great illustration of why everyone should read Homer. When people ask, what is the best translation of Homer, they're already thinking like a Homeric Greek. They just don't even realize it yet. In Homer, we get the earliest depictions of athletic games. These are the ancestors of the Olympic Games. And the Greeks were obsessed with excellence. They wanted to know who the best archer was, the best runner, the best spearsman, the best bard, the best warrior, the best lover, the best whatever. They want to know the best. And so that brings up a lot of questions of how do you evaluate? Notice what happens when you try to answer the question seriously. So we're going to dig into this more later, but I want to set this up first. What does it mean to be the best Greek in an ancient context? How do you come at that question, right? Homer's writing about a warrior culture. So the best Greek would be something like the best warrior, the ultimate warrior. But what does that mean? What does it mean to be the best warrior? Should that be the best in single combat, one-on-one combat? Well, there's a lot of that in the Iliad. That would definitely go to Achilles in the Iliad. but he dies. And after his death, that probably should go to Ajax the Greater. He's the one that everyone turns to when it's a one-on-one combat. They're like, I'd rather he do it than anybody else. But what about this? What about an archer who racks up the most kills, right? That seems like maybe that would be the best warrior. But yet they kind of had a problem with archers. Greeks had deep contempt for archers. Vain archer, trusting to the distant dart, unskilled in arms to act a manly part. Thou hast but done what boys or women can. Such hands may wound, but not incense a man, nor boast the scratch thy feeble arrow gave. A coward's weapon never hurts the brave. From Alexander Pope's The Iliad. Or what about tactical genius, like Odysseus, or strategic genius? So Odysseus may not always be able to go one-on-one with the most powerful, strongest swinger of the axe, like Ajax. But he's the one who comes up with the way to end the war once and for all. Is Oppenheimer the greatest warrior of American civilization because he came up with the atomic bomb, or he helped develop the atomic bomb, which actually ended the war? Or was it the men in the trenches and in the front lines? It's a hard question if you're going to ask, if you have to choose what is the best. It's a very difficult question to ask. Even in the ancient games that are depicted in the Iliad, there isn't necessarily a best athlete, but this is the beginning of trying to come up with the answers to that question of who was the best. And this is where philosophy can now come in and think about this from different angles. So you have to think about, well, how do you compare a runner to a boxer, or a boxer to a charioteer? What do they have in common? What do they have in difference? How do we understand what is the fundamental values of our culture so that we could say that this person is the epitome, the ideal, the top of this category? That's all philosophical, and that all begins with Homer, and that is Greek, that is Homer. And if you've ever asked the question, which is the best translation, you're living in that mode and you don't even realize it, which is why you should read Homer to see where you come from. Today, this question gets very diluted and convoluted. When people go looking for the best translation of the Iliad or the Odyssey, they're usually given one of two kinds of answers. One approach says, find the translation that works for you. And I'll give us some examples later of this type of thing. But it's basically read a few passages, see what hits you in the moment, and go with that. This is extremely popular advice. You see it in blogs, Reddit threads, and even thoughtful YouTube channels by people I genuinely respect and often enjoy watching. But it's a wrong approach, and we'll talk about it. Another approach tries to be more authoritative. I think this is the dominant approach. It offers sometimes charts or rankings, approachable versus challenging, poetic versus literal. But essentially, this approach is you should read this translation because it is the authoritative text that has been approved by the committee of the excellence providers or whatever. Often we call that person or that group publishers, particularly scholarly publishers, publishers like at Cambridge or Harvard. So the latest one of that, let me see if I can find this in this big old pile, is probably the Emily Wilson. That's what people will probably tell you who are of the authoritative bunch. They will tell you, you got to go check out the Emily Wilson, which is a Norton, a academic organization. It's very academic. I love my Norton, by the way. So just so we're clear, I'm not dogging on stuff. I learn a lot from Norton, but I'm going to talk about why it's not the best first approach for people trying to experience Iliad and the Odyssey. So both approaches are interesting, and both, I think, have serious problems, especially for people who are new to Homer. So as one example of the more authoritarian approach, I saw this video recently. These are from some new YouTubers. I'm glad that they're here. I think I'll put a link to their channel. You can check them out. They're doing discussions of Iliad and Odyssey on their new channel. I think it's Winnow, Winnow. I think they met talking about Homer or something. It's a cute married couple, and he was a high school teacher, and she was like doing her thesis. I think it's worth watching. What I want to point out is the way they framed this in one of their more popular videos. The actual evaluations that they have of each of the translators, which we'll go through later, I don't actually necessarily disagree. You know, like the fact that Lombardo translation is more approachable. I think that's really debatable, but I kind of agree with that. I think Lattimore and Fitzgerald and Butler probably are more literal, and they should be on this literal. I think Fagles and Wilson, Emily Wilson, are definitely a little bit on the more poetic. I'd probably put Wilson a little bit more toward the literal, but because she feels a little bit more like a novel, actually. In many ways, even though she's trying to go for an oral poetry, I don't feel it as much. The Pope and Chapman are interesting that they put Chapman more challenging than Pope. And this is my perfect example of why this is what I call deeply subjective. It's based on their own feelings about this from authority, of course, but the concepts, approachable, challenging, are not objective. To say something's approachable is very subjective. One person might find something very approachable, another very challenging. Here's a great example of that. The famous poet John Keats, which they talk about in their video, has one of the great sonnets of all time on first looking into Chapman's Homer. Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. Now, we're not going to break down that whole poem, but what I want to point out is the oft of one wide expanse, had I been told that deep-browed Homer ruled as his domain of the realms of gold, which is a reference or a metaphor for literature and literary imagination. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. So what is he talking about here? The translation that John Keats would have read in the early 1800s is Alexander Pope. And guess what? For John Keats, Pope is more challenging than Chapman. In fact, Chapman who comes before Alexander Pope by 100 years. He writes his stuff. Chapman is more in the time of Shakespeare, and he's really the first major or any real translation into English of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And what John Keats is saying is that the Chapman, the older version, is more approachable than the newer version, which is the opposite of what Winnow says here. Now, my point is not that Winnow is necessarily wrong. I think both of them are probably equally challenging in many ways. I would say in my view, Pope is more challenging than Chapman because of the way and the intentions and the mode by which he's translating, the selections that he makes. But they're both challenging, and my overall point is that this is very subjective, this whole approach, and it comes from a deep authoritarian type mentality. It's saying, look, I know what I'm talking about. I've read many translations. You should trust me and say that this is approachable and take it. So now that we have a sense of different types of translations, which we're going to dig into more, I want to talk about why modern readers struggle with Homer. And again, I want to emphasize that I'm not talking about necessarily why do college kids in a college classroom struggle, but why would an intelligent person who reads literature and wants to read literature, and they exist, by the way, actually there's more of them than I think you realize, but why when they turn to Homer, they're quickly turned off and they switch off and they stop reading. I was first told that Homer was the greatest book ever written when I was like 10 years old by my teacher. And so I liked to read, So I took it as a challenge. I told my parents to go to Walden Books. We picked out whatever translation was there on the shelf. I don't even remember at this point. I went home and I sat down and I started reading and I started crying because I didn't understand a dang word. I was like, I'm not good at anything. I'm not good at this. Like, why can't I do this? As I grew older and I tried it again, I understood a couple things. One is that it was English. I could understand individual words. It was the relationship of words that I was unused to and how it worked. The mechanism and the types of words they chose was just not sufficient or not good for my age group. Also, there's a lot of context that you need to have before reading an Iliad or an Odyssey. When Homer is singing the song of the Iliad or the Odyssey, he is talking to an audience that is extremely familiar with all of these stories. The analogy that I always give in my lectures is imagine creating a brand new Spider-Man story today or Batman to a group of 25-year-old American kids or young adults. You know that they know who these characters are in the basic structure. And I would go it's even further than that though, is at this time, this was their canonical, almost like a religious text. So all the kids, all the adults had some familiarity with the main stories of the Trojan War in the 8th century BC when Homer's writing or compiling this into his great epic story. So that context of what's going on, the backstory, a lot of that's kind of built into the story. You need mechanisms within your translation to help scaffolding for the reader. You have to have that. You cannot expect a 15-year-old boy or girl who's interested in trying this out to have all of that information ahead of time. You can help them, and there's things that I recommend to them, but you can't do that. So if you want to create a great product for young people, you need to scaffold it. And my goal was always to write a translation for a 15-year-old who, has heard of some ancient Greek mythology, but is not an expert on them at all, and still wants to enjoy a good story. Another thing that I recognized later in life is that there are lots of names and tribes and titles everywhere that I just was confusing to even set up a sentence. So the syntax was almost like it was purposefully obscure for a modern audience. Here is a representative example. This is a moment between Zeus and Poseidon. Zeus willing a Trojan victory, Hector's victory, lifting the famous runner Achilles' glory higher, but he had no lust to destroy the whole Argive force before the walls of Troy. All the father wanted was glory for Thetis and Thetis' strong-willed son. But Poseidon, surging in secret out of the grey surf, went driving into the Argive ranks and lashed them on, agonized for the fighters beaten down by Trojans. If you know who Thetis and Thetis' son is, then great. But with the hundreds of names that are told throughout the Iliad and the Odyssey individually, separately, it becomes enormously difficult to take hold of all of them. And this is why you need a little bit of help. Or who are the Dardanians or the Danons or the Argives or the Achaeans? You're like, who the hell are these people? And it's like, you can't even, you literally can't start without all those names already memorized. I remember one translation where it was it says, the son of Atreus did something, right? Or, he was on the battlefield, the son of Atreus. And I'm reading, I'm like looking around, and this was when I was an adult. And I was like, what? Well, there's two sons of Atreus on the battlefield. So which one are we talking about? We're talking about Agamemnon, the king of all the Greek soldiers that are at this Trojan War, the king of the expedition, or his brother Menelaus, who is also the son of Atreus, and he is there, the husband of Helen, and this is kind of the impetus of the whole war. So which one are you talking about, dude? And translators will do stuff like that, and they'll keep things that will almost like they're purposefully trying to obscure you, like, haha, I know these things. It's almost like it's very frustrating when people do this, especially in translation. But when any writer does this, it pisses me off. When they write some epigraph or something in another language and then they don't translate it for you. It's like, hold on a second. Like, you expect me to know Spanish? Like, I don't, or French? Like, I don't know that. I bought a translation, or I'm reading this word. Like, you're just trying to show how erudite you are. And now I got to go look this up. It's like, just translate it. Like, not being a pain in the butt. So what this experience of reading Homer when I was 10 really taught me is it wasn't really about intelligence, and it wasn't even about effort, because I sat down and tried to understand what was going on, even at 10. The problem happens when someone goes from a source material, bringing it to a target audience and a target language. And there's two different approaches you could have with that. You could try to make everything adherent to the source material, or you could try to focus more on the target audience and updating the language and how it's all done. Now, another challenge is innate within Homer. If you're going to do a translation, there is no getting around certain things. And in fact, it's actually why you should read Homer. Homer is foreign to us. He is pre-novel, pre-drama, pre-cinema, obviously, pre-modern poetry. In fact, it's the Homeric Greek is its own special poetic language. Any translations will have some challenges. My point is that scholarly translations add challenges because their end goal and their end product is very different than what a normal or an everyday reader who's an intelligent reader but wants to just have a good story and have a good experience with Homer. So Homer is a storyteller. He's not an academic. He's not writing for a classroom text to be studied. He's trying to tell a story that will activate your emotions, that will make you go and go, he's trying to actually hit your emotions. That's what he cares about. One of my favorite stories of the great playwright of the middle to late 19th century, Henrik Ibsen, he's a Scandinavian playwright, is that he was always thought of and seen by his friends and family as a great observer, including an observer of audiences. So he would go to plays and not just watch the play itself, he would actually turn and watch the audience. His friends thought of him as very odd because he was very interested in how people and what people reacted to. That's the sign of a great artist, a truly great artist. That's not the only sign. You can get obsessed with that in the wrong way. But many artists go the other way and they almost completely ignore the audience and they care little about the audience. Ibsen wanted to know, well, why do people react this way to that kind of speech or this kind of thing or that slap really caused everyone to go like that? And how can I build the kind of tension and stories that lead to that? And Ibsen wrote my favorite, An Enemy of the People, but he also wrote the famous one, A Doll's House, and many other great stories and plays. He was much more focused on being a good storyteller, not being this kind of classicist. It has to be in this kind of meter, in this kind of way, with this kind of story, because that's the way it's always been done, and that's the best way to do it. And Homer translators often do that themselves, but Homer himself is a storyteller. He's much more like the Henrik Ibsens. He's a bard. He probably traveled around, and I always think of him going to like our equivalent of like an outdoor bar, lots of people drinking beer. I mean, they're probably drinking wine or some version of wine at a festival, but still he's going around, he's telling stories that take place over days. People might have been wrapped, but there might be someone, doing something over there that they shouldn't be doing or yelling or something, and he's trying to get their attention at all times. And that's a big focus of the storyteller version of him, is to reach an audience, to get to you so you enjoy it. I think of him also as like a traveling troupe of theatrical artists who are really genuinely interested in getting you engaged in the story. Or like I think most Hollywood filmmakers who get a lot of flack and for doing the same kind of story over and over again. But that's because part of what they're focused on is what the audience actually wants. Now, we're not going to get into why that could be problematic. So to recap this, there are two types of translators fundamentally. They're what I call the monumentalists, or the kind of Homer as a relic that needs to be, the source material has to be revered in such a way that it can't really be touched and altered too much. We need to have, in other words, all the patronymics. which are the naming of a character by their father, son of Peleus, son of Atreus. We need to have all the labels that they would have had. We need to have all of the different types of tribal names that nobody today would ever know anything about. And that all has to be there. And as much as possible, we even need to go and return to that era of the ancient Greek and try to get a modern 21st century Western person to feel like a Greek audience member. And they explicitly say this often, these translators. Now, these translators are almost always professors. They are almost always, they teach Greek and Homer year after year. So the progression normally is something like this. The teacher teaches at a university or a college, or maybe a high school, and they're teaching based on some translation. And, the students read it, they read it, and they go back and forth. Over the years, that professor might start wanting to create their own classroom version so they can teach their own version in the classroom. And so that's the mentality and the mode that they're thinking of. So even the best of these people are inundated with an audience that is classroom oriented. Whether they realize it or not, they are infected with this kind of orientation. Now, this is a perfectly legitimate product. In fact, one of my favorite personal translations is one of these kinds of translations, in my opinion, but it was not my first, or it was not my first awakening moment with Homer, because that required something earlier. It required a different kind of translator. So I think of these monumentalists, I call them, of Homer, treating Homer like a museum artifact to be, meticulously stayed together like a scholar does. It's perfectly legitimate. It is not good for general readers, and it should not be marketed as such. This is my only beef with them in the most part, is that they tend to have this authoritarian approach to their marketing where they say, everyone gets excited. It's like, look, here's the new translation. It's really exciting. It's by this great professor. She's got all the accolades, all the grand blah, blah. And that's what, it's for general readers. And it's like, no. It's not for general readers. You should not read Emily Wilson or any of these first. It's too confusing. There's too many things they do not do to help you get into the flow of understanding and just having a first experience that will hopefully trigger you to have other experiences and learn more and listen more. I mean, just as an example, man, if you get into the Odyssey, there is a wonderful reading on Audible of the Robert Fagles of this one, the Robert Fagles translation of the Iliad, read by Sir Ian McKellen, who's got the greatest voice ever. And I would just kind of listen to that. And you cannot, by the way, you cannot listen to that if you have not read other translations and the Fagles. It's just, in my opinion, you'll be like, what is going on? It's too confusing. But once you have it, oh man, it is a spectacular experience. So the monumentalist mindset is that Homer is essentially almost like an architectural ruin that we have to preserve specifically. He's a museum artifact. So put him behind glass, make him perfect, pristine, as much like the Homer as possible. So these people are always more in line with the reverence for Homer. And here's where it's most important. The meaning is located in that kind of conservation and precision. That's where they spend most of their time and effort, not on what does an audience today need to hear and see and experience. This really has a kind of mentality of, you to read this, you need to join the classroom, go on this big 9-month journey, sign on the dotted line, take their course. Nothing wrong with that. But again, I do that too. So I'm not against this, but I want you to understand the monumentalist mentality. Now I'm going to play a little clip here of Emily Wilson. And she is a translator of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Very controversial recently because, or I guess a few years ago, because of her translation of the Odyssey. I have not read her translation of the Odyssey. I did read the first opening passage. I saw no reason for that one translation. I thought, if just going to rile up the internet bros, it seems like that's what she was doing. She seemed to succeed. I don't see anything overly woke in the Iliad. I don't see anything like that in the Iliad. There may be something wokish in the Odyssey. I did think it was odd to translate the opening passage and call Odysseus a complicated man. I think that is just like, it just throws off the whole fundamental important understanding of what we're trying to get at with understanding this character that has fascinated people for thousands of years. One of the most famous 19th century poems is called Ulysses by Alfred Lord Tennyson, the poet laureate. And he's talking about Ulysses, who's the Roman version of Odysseus. That is Odysseus. And it's like, to call him a complicated man in a modern context seems just really stupid. I don't know how else to call it. Now her translation of the Iliad, I read through most of it actually, and I thought it was just fine. I don't know that we need it. But she has every right to write, to write it. I still think the Fagles is better. It's more enjoyable to read. It's easier to experience. But I think this is just fine. There's nothing wrong with it. It's like, and if you could sell I think she sold over 500,000 books so far. If you could do that, I am always, my hat is off to you. Go for it. I'm all about that. I don't think there's anything negative in it that I can see. It is just a translation, but she is a monumentalist. Here's one quote from her note from a narrator, or note from the translator at the beginning of the Iliad translation. Here, this is very helpful to think about what a monumentalist is, in my opinion. Here's a quote from her translator's note. I realized I could sometimes use lovely, long, polysyllabic English words echoing the original's use of powerfully long, often compound words interspersed with many shorter connectives, verbs, and particles, such as the 4-syllable cataclysmic at the start of book 1. Now, I have no problem with using polysyllabic words or anything like that. And what she means is big words, basically, for those of us dopey folk. She means basically be able to use very long, complicated words if she wants to. I think sometimes more abstract words, in my opinion. In my translation, just as an example, I went the opposite direction. I do have some polysyllabic words, but I really tried to keep that down as much as possible. And I aimed for a 10 to 12-year-old reading level because I wanted someone, who's 12, 13, 14, 15 years old to be able to pick up the book and be able to actually understand it on their own and be able to decipher it on their own. And I think sometimes some of these complicated word choices can get in the way of actually experiencing the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, here's another quote from her translator's note. After many drafts and experiments, I realized that I needed to use more lines than the original to accommodate the numerous names, titles, and patronymics that are all extremely important in the Iliad and in the Odyssey. Now, here's what she says about why she did that. Almost all the warriors of the Iliad yearn to have a name and a story that lasts forever. Their many names and titles as sons and brothers and comrades and fathers and rulers are essential to their identities, their connections with one another, and their fame after death. They fear above all being humiliated, cursed with a negative name, or forgotten and nameless. 100% true, and that is a very important part, especially of the Iliad, but really about the Iliad and the Odyssey. Much of the Odyssey is a journey to discover the story and the heroism of the story of Odysseus and what he did in his life. But there's a question of, do you need to expand the lines and add patronymics and titles to accomplish that? Do you really, for a modern artist, do you really need that in order to understand that these guys live for glory and honor? No, I think there's way better ways to do that, way simpler ways to do that. And I think if you're going to expand the lines anyway, which I'm not afraid of that as such, you should do it with what I chose in my translation, a rule, which is the rule is you cannot just say son of Atreus or son of Peleus without naming the referred person. So it always has to have Achilles, son of Peleus, Agamemnon, son of Atreus. That's a requirement. So why not do that? And still, I think you should limit your patronymics, limit your titles and all those other things. It becomes way too complicated. We are not in a we're not ancient Greeks listening to this thousands of years ago. It's completely unnecessary to do that today. Limiting it, not eliminating it, is what I think should be done if you're not a monumentalist, though. So why do classicists translate this way? We're going to watch a little video here of Emily Wilson on the, I think, Moan, modern ancient podcast on YouTube. I like her. Again, I'll link to her down below. Like, check it out. I definitely suggest watching what she's doing if you're interested in this stuff. It's very good. But I found this really revealing.
Yes, I mean, the most of my research was to do with reading Homeric scholarship and reading the commentaries on the text. I mean, I think it's worth mentioning the other stuff because to me it was a surprise. I mean, for none of my previous scholarly monographs did I feel I need to know what it sounds like when a bow is when somebody shoots a bow, but I need to have those sounds in my head if I want to try to recreate whatever the text might be doing about evoking the sounds of Apollo's arrows swishing through camp. And of course, the English language doesn't have the same vocabulary for sounds or for sight or for color or for feelings in the body. All of these things are very specific to a particular language. I mean, that would be true of any language pair, but the Iliad is so intense in how it represents the body, the feelings, the sounds, that I felt that part of what I need to do in this translation, if my goal is not just to look up some words in the dictionary or tell you, do the kind of translation that you would do if you're an intermediate language student and you're trying to prove to your teacher, I've done the homework and I can tell you for the exam that I'd have done, I know that that's in the genitive case. That's not what I'm doing. But I know this is in genitive case. That's not the point of these translations. The point is to create an equivalent experience to the experience that I might have if I'm a fluent reader of Homer, or that a reader or a listener in antiquity might have hearing these poems. And that's going to include the vividness of this really does evoke those feelings in a way that, of course, is in some ways totally non-naturalistic. As I said before, it's in this traditional poetic form, it's in this weird language that no one spoke, and yet at the same time, there are things that feel visceral and real, like the feelings, like the sound.
So there's a lot that we can dig into with the meaning of what she's saying here and the implications, but this is, to me, a clear sign of a monumentalist. Here's the quote that I want you to focus on. The point of the creation is to create an equivalent experience to the experience that I might have if I'm a fluent reader of Homer, or that a reader or a listener in antiquity might have hearing these poems. And that, my friends, is a great endeavor for Emily Wilson and for us as readers. And I'm glad there are people like this doing that. But it is not appropriate for first-time general readers. It's too heavily oriented toward the source language, not enough toward the target language, which is modern English. Now, she says some interesting things about listening in real life to the twang of a bow so that she can emulate that or have it in her mind when she's translating. And then she says that you can't actually do that in English anyway, which I found kind of interesting. So it's like, but I appreciate her scholarly efforts to recreate. That's what an archivist, a scholar does. And I'm very, very grateful for it. But there's problems with it. I'm going to read two short passages from Book 11 of the Iliad. As reapers in a line along a furrow face one another as they move ahead, gathering wheat or barley in a field for some rich man, the sheaves fall thick and fast. So did the Trojans and the Greeks line up and spring at one another for the kill, and neither side had any thought of flight. Here's another one. And just like farmers plowing down the fields, pushing their way through rows of golden grain, as wheat or barley stalks fall side by side, so too the Trojans and the Greeks charged on, each mowing down their foes without a break. Neither side thought to flee or to retreat. Now, did you think it was clearer for passage A or passage B? And what would you think would be clearer for a 12, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old to see the big reveal. The first one was Emily Wilson. The second one was my translation. Now, I think Emily Wilson's translation is really good. There's some really good stuff here. Let me read something above what I just read to you. Hector bore his round, well-balanced shield and charged ahead, as from behind the clouds a deadly star shines bright, then disappears among the shadows. So Hector sometimes became visible among the fighters at the front, but sometimes harangued the men who lingered at the back. He shone from head to foot with dazzling bronze, just like a flash of lightning sent by Zeus. I actually really liked that. So I thought that was a great little translation there. Again, I wouldn't choose harangue, though, for a first-time reader. I think that's not something that a 15-year-old should, need to know necessarily. They probably should have those, but they may not, and that's what I'm always interested in. What I want you to understand about the monumentalist and the storyteller is that the monumentalist is focused almost exclusively on the source language and the source itself. In this case, you can hear it in her, what she's talking about in her interview, where she's talking about she always wants to go and have you feel what it would have felt like to be an ancient Greek. Now, I think that's a great endeavor, as I've said, but I think it's impossible for a first-time reader. I think you need to get there after you've had a good understanding, a basic understanding of the story. And a storyteller translator is much more interested in trying to help the reader have a first-grade experience of these translations, of these epic ancient works, by bringing the language, by altering things slightly, and not having that kind of reverence to the source, but having a reverence to the target language. That's the big difference. So that's what I call the monumentalists, and they're the monumentalists that are really focused on, I would almost think of them as a subcategory, the authoritarian monumentalists. There's other types of advice, and I think this other one is also very popular, less popular, but still it's out there, and it's best represented by this video by Benjamin McAvoy, hardcore literature guy. Again, I like some of what he does. I have nothing against any of these people, but I think his approach in his video is utterly just bad. I don't know how else to say it. Do not do this. It may be pretty to listen to. There may be something, but it's just the worst possible way to choose which one to actually do. So what he does is he actually gives you what I call the most deeply subjective approach to this. And again, he's not the only one who does this. He probably got this. I've heard this before. I've even used this as a recommendation on a somewhat limited basis, not to the degree that he does. So I totally understand the implication. I don't want to, gang up on the guy too much. He's doing a great job, but man, this is just not how to approach for the first time the Iliad. So what he does is he takes 9 different translations, one long passage, and then he reads it. And he asks you to rate each one as you go, 1 to 10 or A, B, C, D, E, F, whatever, not against each other, just how you feel about it and which one you like the most. He calls this the taste test. Now, I think that's a great metaphor to call it a taste test, because that's exactly what's wrong with it. I mean, imagine if you're a nutritionist and you say, here's all the food that's possible for you. I want you to taste everything, rate it, and then whatever you like the most, that's going to be your diet. And you're going to stick with that diet for the next year or something. It's like, what are you talking about? That is just the worst way to approach this. There are so many things that could go wrong with this kind of thing. I mean, imagine for instance, Benjamin might have his own personal preference, or maybe he has a little bit of extra energy when he's reading each of these translations. So when you're listening to one, it's like, that sounds really good. And you go back and you buy that one, you read it, and you're then thrown off and you hate everything, right? It's like, no. So you cannot just tell people to have, whatever taste test that they want. Your job should be to help guide people to getting to the best translation and helping them actually have an objective framework to accomplish the goals that they want to accomplish. That should be your job. But there's so much subjectivism within the humanities that it's just like, it's why nobody cares about it. The other problems that could happen with the subjective approach is if you listen to Benjamin's video, there's 9 of these translations. You might like the 5th translation and you have no idea why. It just, you're like, oh, this sounds good. The 5th one is Christopher Logue. Maybe the reason the 5th or 6th one hits you and you give it an A is because after 4 rereadings, you now know that particular passage. And so the 5th one actually makes sense finally. So that's the one where sense comes together. So again, this is just so, again, with all due respect, so abysmally the wrong approach that it really makes me question a lot of this person's approach to things. It's just not what you should be doing. What you should be doing is what I'm going to recommend in a few minutes of a better way to think about this to help you. Okay, so what I've created that I hope teachers and other people will use when they're choosing a translation is what I call the Homer translation matrix, just for fun. And this matrix is just a way to visualize different intentions and techniques behind English translations of Homer. If you remember what I showed you at the beginning, there was that very, this is actually what kind of made me think to do this kind of translation, is this very subjective approach, the challenging and approachable. Why is it challenging? Who said it's a challenging? What one thing is, one translation is challenging to one person, but it's approachable to another. Now, the literal to poetic that one's a little bit more of an objective concept, but I wanted to actually have all the concepts be objective. So my matrix has monument Homer at the top and storyteller Homer at the bottom. So do you think Homer is more of a living storyteller and you're trying to bring that alive more for a modern audience? If it's a storyteller approach, then you care extensively about the reception of the audience, not the scholarly apparatus of, how it looks and feels to scholars. So your audience are not students in a university. They are the man, the woman on the streets who just likes to read. That's the big difference between the two of them, is what is the intention of the translator? Are they trying to preserve something deep that they think is important about the language? Are they trying to get meaning stabilized in scholarship? Whereas Homer, the storyteller Homer is still shaping how we think and feel. And that's why I want you to read the story. Meaning is transmitted through story, image, and voice for an audience today, not in the thwang of the bow from thousands of years ago, but how you actually experience an emotional moment in a given section of the Iliad or the Odyssey. And the storytellers are interested in your first encounter at the very least, that you're really excited and you want to continue a study of him. So Homer is not finished. That means we're not unwilling as storytellers to change things, alter things, spoil things, explain things in a kind of way to help you get the best experience while still maintaining a translation from the original Greek. Now, the next section, or the horizontal section, is from the ear and for the page. Which one is it written for? That one's a little bit easier to distinguish. So we're going to go through this quickly. I just want to give you a sense of some of these translators. We could talk about them in future videos more specifically, but this is my rating of the major translations that are out there, and a little bit of why I put them where I put them. So first, we put at the bottom for storyteller Homer is George Chapman. I think George Chapman's intentions and goals was simply to tell a great story for English speakers so they can approach and understand Homer. I think he translates the voice, with force. His language is explosive, compressed, and sometimes wild. He treats Homer as something to hit an audience. The reason it's complicated to us today is because it's written in 1611, not because it's not a storyteller Homer. Chapman is not preserving Homer as a relic. Another storyteller, I'm putting myself in this category for my translation. But we're going to get into that a little bit later, but I'll talk about mine very briefly in a little bit. The next one, and this is my top recommendation. So if you've waited this whole time to hear this, this is my top recommendation for first-time readers. When I was teaching this to busy professionals, this is the translation I chose. That's the one that no one else, when I've been looking this up, no one else is recommending this one. And that's the E.V. Rieu, E.V.Rieu, E.V. Rieu. He is storyteller par excellence. He does something that the others don't really do as much, where he, for instance, tells you in prose, truncated the entirety of the Trojan War cycle, which I believe you have to know if you're going to read it. So he scaffolds it. He also gives you at the front of every chapter, every book of the Iliad and the Odyssey, he gives you this great little synopsis of the actual action in prose right at the top. And then along the sides, you can see he's got these little sections, little narrative sections. Nestor proposes a special counsel to help you know what's going on in case you get lost. So again, he is obsessed with helping you actually experience the Iliad and the Odyssey for the first time. This, by the way, or I should say the Odyssey and then this one, the Iliad, but these two books are what launched Penguin Classics. And I really recommend Penguin Classics and Penguin generally. They do a good job because they are more interested in just smart general readers who want to get their first experience of this. And I would throw into that the whole homeschooling and up to high school level of reading should be at this level. You can graduate if you're interested in pursuing it further, a deeper level. But if you have a bad experience, you're never going to return to it. Just talk to me about mathematics and why I hate math, because I had bad experiences. If you ask me a math question today, I'll start crying. Do not do this. This is ruining all of literature and poetry. It's why nobody likes poetry and literature. And I also put Samuel Butler in here. I think his intention is like this. He's more utilitarian, but he's very page-oriented, explanatory. I find him challenging for this particular reason. Now, here's one, Stanley Lombardo. I think he's a great translation. I think it's a fun one. This one is explicitly meant to be read aloud. So it's much more Homer for the ear, but I still think his intention is a little bit more monument. He wants you to see Homer as like this archaic museum piece a little bit more. That's worthy of our own time today, but it's not. So in other words, he's not manipulating it in the way that I think it could be to help you gain the clarity you need to actually understand the work. Robert Fitzgerald is another great one. I like Robert Fitzgerald. He's not my favorite, but I like him. And I put him a little bit more toward the Homer storyteller, but he's still kind of in the middle there. He trusts, he's a little bit more poetic. I like the poetry of it. Robert Fagles is now my favorite from the non-prose, more monumentalist versions. I like him. I've always liked Fagles. I think he's a great one. He's a good bridge for modern readers, for instance. So if you read an E.V. Rieu, and you're like, I want something more poetic. I want something a little more challenging that, might make me feel a little bit more of the source material, maybe. Then I would recommend the Fagles. Emily Wilson, I think she's more Monument Homer. I think she's much more interested in winning accolades with her peers and seeing, great with her audience, which is an academic scholarly audience, not with everyday audiences. In fact, even the nature of the antagonism that she had by translating a complicated man, where it's like she wanted to piss off a certain group of potential readers in order to look good for another group. I think even that kind of shows you what she's really interested in. I think the more accurate is I like me and I think E.V. Rieu, we're not interested in, someone who's academic or non-academic. We're interested in the human. So I hope that a 15-year-old would read my translation or read the E.V. Rieu translation and turn into someone who really wants to study and master it over a course of a lifetime. But it starts with a great translation. Alexander Pope, I don't like Alexander Pope. He's a classicist. He's like the arc monumentalist. He's an Augustan. So he comes after Chapman, and there's a whole movement going on in English literature to kind of make things more like the great classics, which is where the source of all great knowledge and things like that. And so we have to make it more like that. So they really treat Homer like a monument. It's very, just not the most enjoyable read. Although there's some beauty in it. I've read that one actually. The Lattimore I like as well. And I put that, I think he has a much more line by line fidelity. I think he even maintains the Greek syntax. So this chart that I created, which you can manipulate and change around if you're an expert and you've read all these yourself, the point I'm trying to make is that the objectivity does not come in my placement of these necessarily, because I think there is some choice within it. It's in the definitions and understanding of the concepts of how we categorize them. So is it a storyteller, which means that you're interested more, your animus is more the audience today. That's how Homer was again. Homer cared about his audience in the 8th century BC. If Homer were alive today, he would not have it has to be like this, and we have to get it in this kind of way. We have to have these patronymics. It's like, but these people in front of me don't know what a patronymic is, and they don't know who the son of Peleus is. So I have to change it so they can get it. That's what he would be obsessed with. The monument Homers are the opposite of that. And they want it to be like, you're a Greek in 8th century BC as much as they can get away with. A couple last things before we fully wrap up here. So I want to say something. I do want to pitch you a little bit on my translation of the Iliad. And I'm working on the Odyssey right now. What I've done, so I put myself in the storyteller category. What I've done is I have built upon the tradition of the Chapmans, the E.V. Ryus, who, by the way, E.V. Ryu was not a PhD. He was simply a poet / translator, rhapsode, you could think of him. He was a true poet and writer of fiction himself. His hope was simply to help people have the first great experience with it, which is why he did all the things that he did, and he made it in prose so it was easier to approach. I am building on that tradition. So for instance, just like him, except I even go further than him, I have, at the beginning of each of my chapters, I have a prose section that is one page usually. This one's front and back, that tells you all of the everything that's going to happen in the chapter you're about to read, so you know what you're to expect. I've highlighted each section. So I break it up into sections, like here, the Trojans march to meet their enemies. And here's Paris' cowardice and Hector's rebuke. So there, what I've done is I have given also a 1-sentence synopsis in prose of what you're about to read. So again, this is to help guide somebody to actually enjoy what's going on. And the reason I added a little bit more is that I chose, instead of doing prose, I chose to put this in iambic pentameter, but I had a couple of rules. One is that in any given choice between clarity and strict iambic pentameter, I chose clarity of the sentence. So these are still in sentences. You could still read them and understand the sentences, but it's much more readable as sentences. And in emotional moments, I always wanted to have you feel the force of being there more. And I think some of these other translations, not quite as much. I said at the beginning that if you're thinking which is the best translation, you're already thinking as a Homer. You're already Homeric. And that is the deepest reason why you should read Homer, and really all the great books of literature from Homer to Melville, is because whether you realize it or not, if you're born and raised in the West, or you want to move and study the West, that is the great addition to world thinking and experience and human that we have today. The deep values you hold of the competitiveness to finding the best, or individualism, and meaning the individual's value in relation and separated from the group, the tribe, that is very Western, and it starts in Homer. So if you want to see it start, the seed of individualism, whether you agree with it or not, you have to read Homer, especially the Iliad. The nature of our rebelliousness. So there's a lot of rebelliousness in Western literature. It's not to say that other stories and other places don't have this. They do sometimes, but not like in the West. In fact, the West has the teenage rebel. There's not teenage rebels all over the world throughout all of human history. That's a very new kind of thing. And I think it's a byproduct of the deep entrenched value we have about rebelling against authoritarianism. the questioning of authority, the heroic individual life, again, the obsession with the best, all that stuff, and many, many more concepts are all deeply Homeric, and they are you. You are like this. I am like this. We are born into this world with these values, whether you agree with them or not. It would be great to kind of get to know yourself by going back to the origins of the things that were fed to you, whether you read them originally or not. Okay, last word on retellings versus translations. So a retelling or reimagining is very different than a translation. With a translation, there is a text that most of us use. You can actually find the text of all the Greek literature online for free. It's a great website, and I'll link it down below if you want to see it. You can look at each individual word and study it. It's a wonderful resource. We're all basically building on that. And that's one of the things that without scholars, man, I wouldn't be able to do any of the things that I do. So I never want to sound like I hate scholars. But I do think, as I said, that they're not ideal for creating great products, literary products for people. So a translation of Greek, for instance, is basically taking that and and reading it in the Greek, trying to understand, well, what's the best way to convey that? What's trying to be conveyed in this moment? And then putting it into some kind of English. To give you a sense of the complexity of choices, in the back of my book, I have a section called Translations in the Age of AI. And in there, I have one Greek word, and I have, I think, 50 or 60 different renderings in modern English that can be used, from one word equivalents to two words and short phrases to expanded renderings, contextual pairings, creative compounds, and many more. So the point is that there's almost an infinite amount of choice in the translation, and it's still the original. So there's two different, remember, there's the source and the target language. Which one are you leaning towards is one way to also look at the monumentalists versus the storytellers. Monumentalists are more about the source language and trying to make you feel that in the target language. The storytellers are more interested in the target language and utilizing the source language to help you just have a good story. And then there's retellings. So there was Troy, which is a complete reimagining of the Iliad, essentially. And this was the early 2000s movie by the guys who made Game of Thrones. Very different, but it has a lot of the core elements. That is not, that you should never think of that as Homer's The Iliad or Homer's The Odyssey. That is those director and producers and writers' vision for this particular movie. The Christopher Nolan 2026 movie of The Odyssey is not Homer's The Odyssey. It is Nolan's The Odyssey. What he includes, how he includes it, the stories he tells, it's going to be a truncated, and maybe he'll even add from things outside of the Odyssey to tell you the story he wants to tell you that is inspired by this source material, not even the source language, but a source material. He takes that material and tells his own story. And there's a lot of great retellings and reimaginings. Black Ships from Troy is a great one for kids. I recommend that for younger kids. That does the whole Iliad, Odyssey, and Trojan War cycle. It's a great introduction. So I really recommend retellings and reimaginings, but it's very different than a translation. You read a translation when you're ready to really experience, to the best of your abilities, this particular story. And my recommendation is Evie Ryu. Or if you really want, I would highly recommend, I do think this is a wonderful translation. I worked very hard on this Iliad translation. I hope you will check it out. So as a closing thought, Homer is for the living. He must be brought to life in the right way so that we have more readers of Homer. Everyone should read Homer. Not everyone should master Homer. Not everyone should study the language intimately. But everyone should have a first encounter with the origins of Western civilization.